Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Candace Teal, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Thank you so much for being here. A couple reminders before we get started. You all are muted and your cameras are off, so you can't be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box and we will go over them at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything, it will be posted on our Conservation Nebraska YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. Lastly, there will be a short poll that will pop up on your screen with just a couple of questions. These help Conservation Nebraska to improve on future webinars and events. If you've ever been sitting at home wondering how to help with conservation, this is a great way to help with minimal effort. With all that being said, let's start our celebration of World Wildlife Day. Here with us today is Caroline Jezierski from Nebraska Game and Parks. She's going to tell us a little bit about herself and the program she's involved with. Then we will get into the presentation. Now I'll hand it over to you, Caroline, to get us started.
All right, thank you so much, Candace. My name is Caroline Jezierski, and as Candace said, I work with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and I am the Nebraska Natural Heritage Program Manager. I'll talk a little bit about my program as I get going or throughout the webinar. I also am the co-coordinator for the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, which I will talk about a lot in my presentation. And when Candace contacted me, I thought it was great because I served in AmeriCorps as well many years ago in Northern California with the Watershed Stewards Project, working with California Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Forest Service. And it was a great way to get into conservation and a good kickstart to my career in biology. Since then, I've worked throughout the Pacific Northwest, primarily in salmon fisheries, and then up in Alaska, and I got my master's in marine biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then it's been almost 11 years, I decided to move back to Nebraska. I have family here, so I moved back and I've been working for the Game and Parks Commission for a couple of years. I also worked as a NEPA specialist with the Nebraska Department of Transportation. And also I did wind energy and wildlife for a time with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So today we're going to talk about World Wildlife Day. Let me share my screen so it works. Okay, are you guys seeing the title slide? Candace, can you give me like a...
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, just the slide, nothing else?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so my presentation I titled World Wildlife Day 2022 Nebraska version. So let's jump in. 1 second. Sorry, just getting my screens adjusted. Okay. Oops, let's see if we can get this now. Okay, so the UN World Wildlife Day is a day to celebrate and raise awareness of the world's wild animals and plants. On December 20th, 2013, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed March 3rd as World Wildlife Day. And the theme for 2022 is recovering key species for ecosystem restoration. As you can see, that is across the screen here, across the sea turtle. And if we interpret this theme kind of literally, we could interpret it as a focus on keystone species. So that's actually where we're going to start, is with a focus on keystone species. And so a keystone species, I Googled this, right? So according to National Geographic, is an organism that helps define an entire ecosystem. Without the keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. A little bit longer definition, Wikipedia says that a keystone species is a species which has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance, a concept introduced in 1969 by the zoologist Robert T. Payne. Keystone species play a critical role in maintaining the structure of an ecological community, affecting many other organisms in an ecosystem, and helping to determine the types and numbers of various other species in the community. So if you've ever had a biology class, you're probably thinking of the classic example that I always have heard with Keystone species, or one of the classic examples, and that is sea otters, right? So on the left here, you see the sea otter. And an ecosystem that has a sea otter also has potentially a kelp forest, because the sea otters help keep the urchin numbers down, and the kelp forest can survive then. But if the sea otter is removed from the ecosystem, you end up with what is on the right, which is actually called an urchin barren, because the sea otters aren't there to keep the sea urchins in check. The kelp beds get destroyed and there's nothing left. And so this is a classic example of a keystone species. Now, what's interesting is that people still debate what's a keystone species and what is not a keystone species. And in this classic example, in the past decade and a half or so, there's been a twist to it. And now they've introduced killer whales. And also I just saw an article about white sharks. So if those are present, they might take out the sea otter, and then so it cascades differently. So we're just always learning. But regardless, if the sea otter is gone from the ecosystem dramatically changes, and therefore it's a keystone species. Now, let's bring it back to Nebraska, because, as you see on this map here now, you are all aware, if you live in Nebraska, we are many, many, many miles from an ocean, and the sea otters hang out there on the Pacific coast. So let's think about some Nebraska keystone species. Nebraska is a Great Plains state. And so what we have here are a lot of different types of prairies. Historically, the state was covered with prairies. On the eastern part of the state is the tall grass prairie. The central part of the state is mixed grass prairie. The north central is the sandhills prairie, and this is a unique prairie that grows over sand dunes. And then we have the short grass prairie out in the western part of the state. So when we think about what species might be keystone species for a prairie, a couple may come to mind for you, and I'm going to talk about two. And I'm going to start with one that you may not have thought of, in part because it's not something that I see a lot around Nebraska at this point. So we're going to talk about the North American beaver as a keystone species. And they're a keystone species because they are considered ecosystem engineers. They completely reshape watersheds, and they create ponds and wetlands. So they'll turn a stream into a series of ponds and wetlands. And these ponds and wetlands have been shown to benefit fish and birds and other organisms, filter pollution, store groundwater and carbon, prevent floods, and help with climate adaptation. And the way the ponds and the wetlands can do that is one prediction for climate change, especially in, actually that's something we're kind of already seeing in Nebraska, is an increase in storm intensity. And so if we get a lot more rain at once, for example, if it's running down your street, you see how quickly it runs down the street. Whereas if it's in a stream where it encounters these ponds and wetlands, it's going to slow down, and it will actually make it so there's less runoff, and it'll make the area more adaptable, and it will help prevent floods. And so these guys are important for how they shape the watershed, shape their ecosystem. Historical literature in Nebraska says that they were once very abundant. In fact, a newspaper account from 1919 stated, "The entire stretch of the Republican River is beaver ridden. So is the Platte west of Grand Island, and the Niobrara has them by the hundreds all along." But the fur market demand for beaver pelts way back in the 1800s led to overharvesting. And actually in 1907, beavers became protected in Nebraska. That protection has changed a lot over the years. And one of the things that affected beavers, in addition to the fur harvest, so that kind of came first through Nebraska, but then settlement came through. And the settling of the land resulted in humans not so much liking the way that the beavers were modifying the waterways and engineering, because they would flood the land, they would change the course of the stream. And so as a result, beavers would be removed, either physically removed, put someplace else, or killed as nuisance animals. So this is a keystone species that once was much more prevalent in Nebraska and now is no longer here. And but what's, I think, really cool is there's this recognition now that the removal of beavers from the ecosystem has caused incised streams. So on the left side of this slide, at the top, you see an incised stream. So it's a very deep, narrow stream. And then you see the image below it. And when beavers were taken out of the system, the streams became more incised. And then you can see the water table there. It says the water table, it actually dropped because now the water's flowing through this deeper trench. So in areas where there maybe aren't beavers around, or they're not beavers in a lot of numbers, or biologists want to attract beavers to an area, they have started using beaver dam analogs, or BDAs. And in the first picture there on the left, they show two different, they're fake beaver dams they put in. And by putting these beaver dams in, as you move to the image to the right, you see that the stream, it starts to meander a bit. It starts to cut on the outside of the curves and deposit on the inside of the curves. The water starts to slow. And when this happens, the stream becomes widened as well. And then if there are beavers in the area, they may wander into this stream and say, hey, this stream is starting to look good. We're going to modify. We're going to build some more dams. Maybe they'll maintain the BDAs. And then as the water starts to slow, sediment is caught, and you end up with what they consider a restored stream all the way to the right. And this is just a maze of ponds and wetlands. And you see that in that image or that picture, there's, lots of different beaver dams that are being maintained. And there's this really complex habitat. Also, the water table is higher up. And this area is going to act more like a sponge instead of a chute. And the fact that it's being called a restored stream is interesting, because a lot of people in the known history, they would say, no, I've never seen a stream looking like that. And that's because the beavers were removed from the system for so long. When I was working in Oregon on salmon, I was actually doing coho salmon carcass surveys on a stream. And the stream was just like a normal stream. There was cobbles and rocks and riffles and runs and whatnot and pools. And then the first time I was surveying it, I got to this beaver dam. And so I'm supposed to be looking for salmon carcasses, which, they're like 2+ feet long. They're big. But I figured, okay, well, I'll crawl over the beaver dam, see what I can see. And the water went from being about calf deep to waist deep, and deeper than that in some areas. I didn't want to push it. And it didn't take me long to realize, like, I'm not going to be able to see salmon carcasses. And this is really pretty sketchy to walk through. I don't want to fall into a deeper hole or anything like that. I was doing surveys on my own. And so I just started to cut that section of the survey off, figuring I'm not going to see anything up there. But what's interesting is coho salmon in particular are a salmon species that thrive in streams where there are beaver dams in those ponds. And so with the removal of those dams out west and some of the salmon streams, those species were impacted. And I suspect the same is true for here in Nebraska. I just don't have that information. But what is great is that where they've been doing this out west, they're seeing it work. But also, out west, where they've been doing it is mostly on private land, or public land. In a state like Nebraska, that's primarily privately owned, this sort of thing might be a little bit more challenging. But there is a new grant that will be starting, and they're going to be looking at beaver dam analogs and similar structures and seeing how they work in some of our Nebraska streams. And this is really exciting. And in fact, I've talked with biologists that work for our agency in other parts of the state, and they have some landowners that are even interested in trying this. And so I'm hopeful that we can start doing some of this sort of restoration in Nebraska. And I'm definitely a beaver believer. And you can actually check out, there's websites like Beaver Believer websites. There's some really cool information. If this is something that's interesting to you, there's webinars and everything to check out how beavers can really change the landscape, engineer the landscape. So that is one example of a keystone species that is still in Nebraska, just doesn't have nearly as large of a footprint as it used to. Now, the second one, I'm sure you've heard of as well, maybe you thought of this one right away, is the prairie dog. Now, what's interesting, I guess there is still some debate whether prairie dogs are keystone species, but I'm saying, yeah, they're keystone species. And so they do full-scale landscape alteration. They create towns, they dig, and when they create these towns, they clip the grasses around there very short. So it ends up like these towns are kind of bare surfaces. And actually those open patches are oftentimes surrounded by shrubs and taller grass. So they create a mosaic of different habitat types across the landscape. And their tunneling, it acts like tilling of the soil. And so it's promoting the nitrogen uptake by plants. And their tunnels actually allow rainwater to flow into the soil and to remain in the water, or and then also their scat, which is their poop, acts like a fertilizer. So they are literally providing nutrients to the soil, helping that soil take up that nutrients, helping it be watered, all of that. And they also, the burrows that they create, their tunnels, provide shelter for other species, such as critically endangered Blackfoot ferret, the swift fox, the burrowing owl, the mountain plover, and a variety of snakes. And maybe not as happy, or like, depends on how you view this, they also are a good food source for a lot of different predators, including some of those predators that they also provide shelter for. Swift fox, golden eagle, red-tailed hawk, American badger, coyote, ferruginous hawk, black-footed ferret, bobcats. All of them have been known to prey on prairie dogs, and they will also be known to be around the prairie dog towns. And in fact, in Nebraska, if you want to see a burrowing owl, you probably need to find a prairie dog town, and you will see the burrowing owls there. So these guys, again, are ecosystem engineers, altering the landscape with by creating these mosaics of barren areas. And as you may have guessed it, they have some human conflict as well. In the past, there were vast dog towns that stretched for miles. It's estimated that in the late 1800s, there were 700 million acres in North America inhabited by prairie dogs. That's hard for me to picture because that's a lot. But their range has been greatly reduced. And in a state like Nebraska, we're kind of unique in that the eastern part of the state, we have a lot of row crop agriculture, but the western part of the state, we have a lot of rangeland. And if you go east of Nebraska, a lot of the states are almost all row crop agriculture. And if you go west of Nebraska, there's a lot more just open rangeland and not as much agriculture. So we kind of have a mix here, and definitely habitat loss impacted prairie dogs. but also concerns over the impacts to cattle and ranch land have resulted in lethal control of prairie dogs. Currently, there is a bill being reviewed by the Nebraska legislature to modify the prairie dog take rules, not take rules, but how prairie dogs can be removed from someone else's land. And so they're either seen as like a nemesis or just a cute, cuddly ecosystem architect, engineer. The poster here on the right is from the Great Plains Ecotourism Coalition, and they are available for sale. So they're promoting prairie dogs as a tourist attraction. So it is just a full range. If you Google prairie dogs, you'll see a whole bunch of issues come up. But regardless, they are engineers and they are a keystone species of the prairie. All right, so if we return to this concept, recovering key species for ecosystem restoration, if we were able to actually recover beavers and prairie dogs, if we could completely ignore any of the social aspects of it, then we could see ecosystem restoration because those are ecosystem engineers, both of them. But that's something that is going to be difficult to do. So let's look at this theme in a different way, okay? So instead of recovering key species for ecosystem restoration, looking at it really like a keystone species idea, let's instead look at it as this motto, or saying, join us to support the conservation of endangered species and their ecosystems. And actually, when I scrolled down the website, this was more of what their theme was for 2022. And it really is to raise awareness about endangered species and their ecosystems and the conservation of those. So let's look at it. Let's look at today's World Wildlife Day with this in mind, instead of just the focus on those keystone species. All right, so if we're looking at endangered species, we do have a number of endangered species in Nebraska. We don't have the sea turtle, right? That was shown in that picture, but we have a number of species protected under the Endangered Species Act, which is the ESA, and that's a federal law. We have, for example, for birds, the Eskimo curlew, the whooping crane. For mammals, we have the black-footed ferret. For fish, we have pallid sturgeon and Topeka shiner. For invertebrates, we have the Salt Creek tiger beetle, which there's a great little photo of it there, and the scale shell mussel. And for plants, we have blow-out penstemon. Now, we also have a state law in Nebraska that protects endangered species. And we have our own list here. So a species may be doing fine across its range, across the United States, but if it's not doing well in Nebraska, we put it on our list so that we work to recover that species in our state. But we do have this statute that if a species is on the federal ESA list and it is found in Nebraska, it automatically goes onto our state list. So we have all the species that I just read off, but then we also have interior least tern bird, swift fox, which is a mammal, 2 fish species, sturgeon chub and black nose shiner, and saltwort, which is a plant that is found in saline wetlands just north of Lincoln, hangs out, well, I should say it the other way, that Salt Creek tiger beetle would hang out in the same area as the saltwort. And so these are just the species we have as endangered in Nebraska. So in total, we have 9 federal and state listed endangered species, 6 state listed endangered species, 6 state and federally listed threatened species, and 10 state listed threatened species. Now, all of these species are protected by law. And we can get some funding to conserve these species, to help restore them. But, we also take a broader approach to species conservation. And the reason is, if you look at Nebraska's species diversity, it's estimated we have more than 30,000 species Okay, most of those are invertebrates, but we still have 60 amphibian or reptile species, 80 fish species, 400 bird species, 85 mammal species, and more than 1,400 plant species. And we haven't identified really like our fungi yet and some of the other things. We'd like to branch out and do those things, but this is a lot of species for us to like learn about at this point. So only 15 species are listed on the Environmental or the Endangered Species Act, and only 31 are listed under our state. So if we were to only work on conserving those species in their habitats, we'd be missing a whole bunch of different species. And if we aren't focusing on those other species, there's a chance that they may become threatened or endangered. So we are going to, oh, and this is where state wildlife action plans come into play. Now, each state was required to create a state wildlife action plan, which is also called a SWAP. And this was in order to get funds to help recover these species. But it's really, the goal is to provide an essential foundation for the future of wildlife conservation. Each state writes theirs a little bit differently, but there are some themes that have to be covered in every state's SWAP. Now, in Nebraska, we call our SWAP the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. And the first one was developed in 2005. The version 2 was updated in 2011, came out in 2011. In 2018, there was an update on the species statuses, and we will be updating the Natural Legacy Project in 2025. It'll be completed. And I put 2 different examples here of what the plan looks like, right? So you have the nice worn-in book, and this is what a lot of our biologists have. They have it in their vehicle. They take it out, they look at it. The other one is what the PDF version looks like if you download it online. And you are welcome to do so. It's got a lot of cool information in there, actually. And we're going to talk a lot about the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project now. All right, so there are 4 goals identified in our legacy project. The first is to reverse the decline of at-risk species. And the hope is that we can then avoid the need to list them as state or federal threatened or endangered. The second is to recover those species currently listed and allow for their delisting. Last year, we delisted the river otter from our state list, and that was a conservation success. They had recovered to the level that they no longer needed to be listed. The third is we want to keep common species common. Self-explanatory there. And the fourth is we want to conserve natural communities. And this is, the natural communities is sort of covers the ecosystems and the habitat of the species. But we have some very unique natural communities in Nebraska we want to conserve. So the Nebraska Natural Heritage Program is the program that I am the manager of. And our program tracks more than 800 species and natural communities. And we focus on those that are most at risk of extinction or decline. And so we house a lot of the information about these at-risk species. And we also are the program that is responsible for helping ensure that the best scientific information is used for conservation of our species in Nebraska. Now, the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, in that plan, 735 at-risk species are identified. 119 are considered tier 1. And so those are the ones we're more concerned about. And those tier 1 species also include a lot of our listed species. And 616 are tier 2 species. And those are the ones we're not quite as concerned about. And there are a lot of plant species in our tier 2 list. And what is interesting is Nebraska is one of the few states in the US that included plants in their SWAP. And lots of states are rushing to include plants now because there might be additional funding if you have plants in your SWAP. But we've had plants from the get-go. Nebraska has recognized the value of plants and the value of natural communities. Okay, so Thinking about how we are going to reach the goal of, conserving at-risk species, bringing listed species back so they can be delisted, keeping common species common, and conserving natural communities. If we look at this map here, all of the colored areas, so not the off-white or gray or whatever you want to call it, those are all public lands. And you notice there's a lot of public lands out west. Nebraska, you don't see too many. In fact, if we zoom into Nebraska, you see that we have very few public lands. And in fact, about 97% of Nebraska is privately owned. And so as we think about like, man, how do we conserve these species? It's not, we can't rely on the Forest Service or the federal or Fish and Wildlife Service lands or our Park Service lands, which a lot of the Western states, they can rely on those lands to conserve a lot of their biodiversity, but we don't have that option in Nebraska. So where do we go from there? Well, this is where the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project mission comes into play. And the mission is to implement a blueprint for conserving Nebraska's floral, fauna, and natural habitats through the proactive voluntary conservation actions of partners, communities, and individuals. And we're going to break it down. So to implement a blueprint for conserving, the goal is to have the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project be the conservation plan for Nebraska, for wildlife, biodiversity. Nebraska's floral, fauna, and natural habitats, we're including the plants, the animals, the natural plant communities. Essentially, we're looking at the biodiversity of Nebraska, how we can conserve the biodiversity of Nebraska in this plan through the proactive voluntary conservation. So this is non-regulatory actions. When I was talking about listed species, usually listed species, there's regulatory actions, like you can't impact them and you're required to do something if you impact them. With this, the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, we're doing non-regulatory. And lastly, actions of partners, communities, and individuals. This plan is meant for everyone. It's not just for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. So it is a blueprint, conservation blueprint for everyone in Nebraska to use. Now, again, if we look here at the map and see the lack of public lands, we can better understand these guiding principles that were put in place. Now, the Natural Legacy Project is, there's a partnership team that guides the development. And the partnership team consists of folks from the Game and Parks Commission, but also other nonprofit conservation organizations, but then also like cattlemen associations and that sort of thing. So a diverse group of folks. And they came up with three primary guiding principles. And the first is that through the process of development, the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project shall be open, transparent, and inclusive, be built on a foundation of sound economic and scientific principles, and keep the public informed and involved. And when we we're gonna probably start, probably next year already, if not towards the end of this year, start our process for revising the plan to have it completed in 2025. And if it's something that you want to be a part of, we'll have meetings and you can join in and provide your input on the plan. Also, the blueprint produced by the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project shall recognize private landowner participation is critical to the project's success. So we're recognizing that we can't do conservation in Nebraska unless it's done on private lands, and we can't be successful unless it's done on private lands. We recognize and respect property rights and address property issues. It shall have opportunities for conservation actions and partnerships across the state, shall ensure all participating are respected and treated fairly, shall encourage involvement through consistent and thorough information exchange, and shall provide opportunities for developing conservation partnerships regardless of ownership. And for the past 10 years, 11 years, we have had a Nebraska Natural Legacy Project conference. It's usually, well, it's been virtual the past couple of years. There's usually a small fee to attend, but we give updates. People provide research presentations that they've done, learning more information to help conserve Nebraska's wildlife, or they may present on some management techniques they're using. So that's one way for the exchange. Also, the conservation partnerships, we work a lot with private landowners, owners to get conservation on their land. So, and I say we, I mean, some folks in my programs do, but then also we have a whole bunch of biologists that are in positions where they're called partnership positions, and they work with different organizations and with different landowners. So I'm using the big we, agency we. All right, and the third is conservation actions as a result of the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project shall be voluntary and incentive-based and minimize the use of land acquisition as the primary tool for habitat conservation, and instead principally use actions directed towards conservation on private lands. And this is, this may be surprising to some folks, because you think about, well, hey, if we put it in a conservation easement, it's protected forever. Or if we buy it. So if a conservation organization buys the land, it's protected forever. But in order to have the plan be more broadly accepted and to get buy-in and better partnership, we instead work with landowners so that they can keep managing their land, but just managing it in a way that helps conserve biodiversity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so to direct conservation activities in Nebraska, we have these biologically unique landscapes. Now, these were developed based on information of known locations of natural plant communities and at-risk species. They also, there have been discussions about these. There's been input from local biologists and landowners and whatnot who have helped develop the borders for these. And in fact, there's been modifications in 2011. There were some changes. So these areas are actually, they're put together with the idea that if we can do biodiversity conservation in these areas, if we can focus on these areas in green, we have a pretty good chance of actually conserving a full array of biological diversity. So it's really it's a strategy for us to be able to say, hey, let's focus on the Central West Hills. Actually, Nebraska Environmental Trust, when they have their grants, if you say you're working in a biologically unique landscape, you score some more points because they recognize the value of using these biologically unique landscapes to target our conservation. It's still a large part of the state, but it gives us more of a target in a fairly large state. All right. In the Natural Legacy Project, there is a section, Actions to Overcome Barriers and Threats. And these are the things that were identified in 2011 as things that we need to improve upon. And not just we as the Game and Parks Commission, but just in general as conservationists, that things we need to improve on. So we have increased collaboration and communication, increased environmental education, improve conservation programs and incentives. And these are things such as community or CRP land communities reserve program, or some of the other incentives that state and federal agencies have for doing conservation on private lands. Facilitate species and ecosystem adaptation to climate change. This is a topic I work on, and this is a challenging one for sure, to try to determine how we can best manage and look at climate change, best manage for climate change. promote management that is more compatible with conserving biological diversity, focus on conservation best opportunities, that's similar to what I talked about with the BULs, maintain and expand the network of public and private conservation lands, demonstrate success. We have a number of demonstration sites across the state that show successful conservation in a number of different habitats. And those are, a number of those are on publicly owned lands, so you can go check them out. Increase participation in nature-based recreation. By doing that, people can have a better appreciation for what we have here in Nebraska. Now we're going to dive into one of those a little bit more, and we're going to look at the promote management that is more compatible with conserving biological diversity. And these are a number of different management techniques, so first, fire. So putting fire back on the land, grazing. So different types of rotational grazing can benefit different species. Hydrology. So looking at if we are draining wetlands or channelizing streams, how that might be impacting our biodiversity, and maybe we need to modify that. Invasive species, they are a continuous problem. So looking at how we can manage invasive species. Just for example, we'd like to modify some culverts so that our native fish can pass, but we want to ensure that those culverts aren't modified to the point where invasive species can pass. So it's a concern, like if there's a barrier to invasive species in a stream, let's keep that barrier there. Things that, wouldn't think of necessarily. Habitat fragmentation. So looking at, can we minimize, for example, for something like wind energy development, can we encourage that development to happen in row crop agriculture lands instead of, native prairie? Because once the roads go in and the turbines go in, you're fragmenting, you're breaking up the land, you're creating edges. And a lot of species don't like edges. And a lot of our prairie species like large spaces to live in. And then also how we can deal with pollution. So whether that's pollution from cities or crops, how we can better manage pollution to help conserve our biodiversity. We're going to look at one of these in more detail, fire. And fire is an important influence on biodiversity. Now, excuse me, when I'm talking about fire, I'm not talking about this sort of fire, like the catastrophic fire, the crown fires that kill everything. No, fire is a management tool. We're talking more fire like this. So these are both pictures of examples of prairie fires. They are called prescribed fires. And you can see the flames are low and they are moving slowly across the land. And so this is more of the type of fire I'm talking about when I'm talking about using fire as a management tool. So I helped on a fire at Indian Cave State Park a couple years ago. And so I had never been on a prescribed fire before, but I had seen forest fires, like huge forest fires when I lived out west. But so I helped on this fire and it was creeping across the forest like the one here on the left, the very low, very slow creep across the forest. And that's because they've been conducting controlled burns in that park every year for several years now to help regenerate the oak forest there. So it wasn't what I was expecting. It was fun, but it wasn't like scary exciting. So fire as a management tool is really, it can be used in the prairies and it can be used in our oak woodlands as well, or excuse me, our woodlands as well. And so let's talk about the influence on biodiversity. So when fires go through, they promote nutrient cycling. They create microhabitats because the fire doesn't burn consistently. And for example, in a forest, it may burn around a tree and leave a spot there. Microhabitats or small habitats are used by different species because different species like different heights of grass. So for example, they create these microhabitats. They increase plant vigor and native plant diversity, which is very important. And they reduce invasive species like red cedar. And this last bullet is one of the reasons why fire is being implemented more broadly across the landscape in Nebraska. Red cedars have been slowly marching across the state, and they are invading grasslands and lands where people are ranching, where they're running their cattle. And as it turns out, like cows don't like red cedars, nor do wildlife. And so the red cedars are having a pretty big impact on their grazing and on their production. So there are new, there are folks that are getting together as neighbors and having fire units. There's a lot more fire management on the land now. And, historically in the eastern part of Nebraska, fires would have burned the prairies at a 1 to 5 year interval. And in western Nebraska, the fires would have burned at a 10 to 20 year interval. So, you can picture if the state was like, all prairie, you get a strike of lightning and it's going to go. But since we've had fire suppression and habitat modification, roads, row crop agriculture, all of these things have stopped fire from going across the state. And now we're having to put it on the land. So kind of interesting. Now in the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, it mentions that controlled burns or prescribed burns and cattle grazing is not something that's been looked at much. This picture of the cattle is actually the cattle on land that was recently burned. As part of prescribed fire. But what we're finding is we are doing this in Nebraska some, and we're seeing an increase in biodiversity and forage. And Nebraska's kind of ahead of the game with this. We put a lot more fire on the ground than other states do. And we look at and then we have the combo of the grazing. So it's pretty exciting. And so as we think about World Wildlife Day, let's look at it Nebraska style. And let's say, join us and support biodiversity conservation. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions, I am open for questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline. You did such an amazing job at tying in the theme of World Wildlife Day into the work being done here in Nebraska. Like I had no idea the amazing programs we had in place to protect our endangered species. That's so cool. If anybody has any last minute questions, you can put them in the chat now. Also, that same poll from the beginning is going to pop up on your screen in a second, and we would appreciate you filling that out. As for the questions we have now, we had a lot of beaver love in the chat. George says in the Great Plains, ice and beaver activity were the principal disturbance mechanism that lead to stream channel migration. Very true. Just like Brianna said, they're the engineers of the ecosystem. I really loved that phrase that you said, the beaver believer. Like I immediately, as soon as you said that, I wanted to go and get it printed out on a shirt or something. That was so cool. And then
I want to add, so George Cunningham, he has contributed to the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. He is a fish specialist for us in the state.
Oh, thank you for all of your work, George. Let's see, we have a couple of questions. An anonymous attendee wants to know what programs are there for landowners to help conserve at-risk species?
Okay, there are several, and it would be, let's see, I would have to direct you to some websites and let's see, actually, maybe you could contact Eric Zach, Z-A-C-H, so eric.zach@nebraska.gov, or I can give information to Candace and she can send it out to the participants, because there are a lot and they're kind of moving targets actually, so they change from year to year, but there are a number. There's ones where you can put pollinator habitat on your land. Yeah, there's a lot of different programs out there.
Okay, yeah, that would be great if you have that information. We can send it out in an email after the webinar. Let's see, another anonymous attendee wants to know what indicator species are.
I would say indicator species are ones that would be more sensitive and would be, so if that species was impacted, then you would know that something is not going well in the ecosystem.
That makes sense. And then Mary wants to know, what is something city folks can do to help biodiversity?
Mary, that's a really great question. And one thing that's going on right now at the national scale is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And part of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is that, well, first off, if it goes through, we're going to say when it goes through, Nebraska will get about $17 million annually to help conserve our wildlife. And part of that program also wants to focus more on city folks, urban wildlife, getting urban biologists, and looking at promoting more biodiversity education in cities. In a state like Nebraska, the vast majority of our population lives in cities. And so our Fish and Wildlife Education Division is working on how to reach out more to urban folks to get them involved. And you are welcome to, if you want to reach out to our representatives in Nebraska and ask them to support RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Also, as somebody who lives in a city, you can keep up with the Nebraska legislature as well. Sometimes there are bills that come up that may be useful for you to comment on because it may impact wildlife. If you haven't done your taxes yet this year, there's the wildlife checkoff. You can add some money and those funds, as well as if you get a license plate that's either sandhill crane, ornate box turtle, or bighorn sheep, those they're $5 a year, and all of those funds go to the Wildlife Conservation Fund. And the Wildlife Conservation Fund helps fund research and other projects for these at-risk species. Game species get a lot more money for conservation than these at-risk species do. So those sort of funds are really helpful for us. And I'm going to go out on here. So Candace here, part of her section, she works with pollinators. I live in Lincoln, and one of the things that I notice that happens a lot is people like to really keep their yards really well groomed. And I would say, don't rake up your leaves in the fall. Let them wait until the spring, until we've had some warm days. A lot of invertebrates are going to overwinter in those leaves. And if you pick them up and throw them away, you're throwing away those invertebrates. If neonicotinoids are used on plants that you buy, or you're using those sort of chemicals on your plants, then you are impacting our pollinators. And one of the things that's interesting is that just anecdotally, monarchs are have been considered for being listed in the threatened and endangered species list at the federal level. But like in Lincoln, I see a number of monarchs, and we might actually be sort of a haven for monarchs because people do tend to water. So when we have more drought conditions out in the prairies, if we have plants that the monarchs can feed on, can nectar on, and they're in bloom, that might be helpful for them. And for monarchs and pollinators in general, having plants that bloom throughout the seasons, including letting those dandelions stay in your yard, and some of the other weeds that come up, because of the earliest weeds that come up in the spring, those can provide beneficial food sources. Also, just with your yard, you can make your yard certified wildlife friendly by having a water source, by having like stick piles there, or you can just look at what you can do to make your yard more wildlife friendly and hope that your neighbors don't get upset. But actually, one of the things I think would be great is if we could have a look maybe at the ordinances in cities, be planting more, native plants in our parkways. I think there's a lot we could actually do in cities to help our biodiversity. There can be some good jumping off areas, stopping points. We're not going to necessarily help those super rare species, but we could help out some. So
That was such a great answer. Thank you so much. I had a question because you were talking about how in 2025 you guys are gonna like revise the Natural Legacy Project. And then you also mentioned like how maybe we could get involved if that was something we were interested in. How could we do that, like members of the audience?
yeah, so we will be going around, we'll have public meetings. So when the plan is revised, we have a partnership team that oversees, but then we also have several science teams, and these consist of species experts. So they're going to review the species and say, well, is this species, are we still concerned about it? Has it recovered? Has it gotten worse? We have an education team that consists of education specialists. So we have all these different teams, and they contribute to the primary writing of the document. But then also we will go out and do public meetings and talk with people. For example, we may look at it, we might have some questions for folks, in the past, that's why the biologically unique landscapes changed a bit. And because of some public input. So there's definitely, that's the thing, is it's supposed to be participation. We're supposed to be able to enable participation of folks. So if it's something you're interested in, you can go out to check out the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project website, and there will be information, and we'll be ramping up, in the next year. And actually, we were supposed to revise it in 2021, but because of that public participation component, we were concerned that we weren't going to be able to do meetings well enough, because we're like, well, now that we know it's Zoom, and people actually, some meetings more people show up to Zoom than in-person meetings, but we weren't sure at that time, and we weren't sure if that would actually qualify for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's requirements. So we were able to get an extension to 2025, and 2025 is when most states are updating their plans. So there'll be this big push throughout the US to update their plans.
Cool. Now that I know about it, I'm like interested. I'm gonna like keep getting updates on it. Well, it seems like there's no more questions. So Carolyn, thank you so much for all of the wonderful information about the Natural Heritage Program and the Natural Legacy Project. And also thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And then to the audience, thank you guys also for coming to learn with us. We appreciate all of you so much. Again, my name is Candace Till with Conservation Nebraska, and I'll be sending a follow-up email to you tomorrow with some information from this webinar. Also, check out our Facebook page for more upcoming events, and we hope to see you all at another event in the future. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks for attending.